There are people alive today whose DNA suggests they should not exist in the places they were born. Their genetic signatures point to a past that was never recorded, a lineage that appears to have been separated, protected, and quietly carried through generations without ever fully mixing with the world around it. Modern science wasn't supposed to find anything like this. But when researchers began mapping human DNA at a global scale, they uncovered something deeply unsettling. A pattern that looks less like natural history, and more like intention. At first, the anomaly appeared small. A few individuals from different parts of the world showed unusual genetic markers that did not align with their regional populations. These markers were subtle, easy to overlook, almost like background noise in the data. But as databases grew larger and algorithms became more precise, that noise began to repeat. Again and again, across continents, researchers found fragments of the same genetic signature embedded in people who had no known connection to one another. It didn't make sense. Human DNA follows patterns. Migration leaves traces. Isolation creates clusters. But this looked different. It looked like a thread, carefully woven through time, appearing just often enough to survive, but never enough to be obvious. The first explanation seemed simple. Hidden migration. Perhaps a small group of people had moved across regions centuries ago, leaving behind descendants in unexpected places. History is full of lost journeys and undocumented movements. But when scientists tried to map this theory onto the genetic data, it didn't hold. The timelines didn't match. The distribution was too precise. And most importantly, the genetic markers themselves showed something unusual. They had remained remarkably stable over time, resisting the kind of variation that normally occurs when populations mix. In simple terms, this lineage had not been blending into surrounding populations the way it should have. It had been preserved. That realization shifted the entire investigation. Because preservation implies something very different from migration. It suggests boundaries. It suggests control. And it raises a question that scientists are not always comfortable asking. Could human lineage be intentionally maintained? As researchers dug deeper, they began to notice another pattern. Many of the individuals carrying this genetic signature also shared subtle physiological traits. Nothing extreme, nothing that would stand out immediately, but enough to create a quiet consistency. Slight variations in immune response. Unusual resistance to certain diseases. Even minor neurological differences that affected perception and memory. None of these traits were dramatic on their own, but together, they formed a profile. A biological fingerprint. And it was consistent across individuals who had never met, never shared culture, never shared history. The deeper scientists looked, the more the mystery expanded. Archaeological records offered fragments of possible answers. In certain ancient burial sites, researchers found remains that carried early versions of the same genetic markers. These remains were often buried differently from others around them, sometimes in isolated sections, sometimes with objects that suggested status, importance, or even secrecy. It was as if these individuals had been set apart. Not necessarily worshipped. Not necessarily feared. But recognized. Marked as different. And then there were the texts. Scattered across cultures, across centuries, there are stories of chosen lineages, families that were said to carry something special, something that had to be protected. Most historians treat these as myths, symbolic narratives meant to explain power or identity. But when these stories are placed next to the genetic evidence, they begin to feel less like fiction, and more like distorted memories of something real. Still, correlation is not proof. And science demands explanations. So multiple theories began to emerge, each attempting to make sense of the data without stepping too far beyond established understanding. The first theory is the most conservative. It suggests that this genetic pattern is the result of extreme endogamy, or closed breeding within specific groups. In other words, certain families or communities may have intentionally limited who they married over many generations, preserving specific genetic traits. This is not unheard of in human history. Royal families, isolated tribes, and cultural groups have all practiced forms of genetic preservation. But this theory has limits. Because the pattern we see here is not confined to a single region or culture. It appears globally, disconnected, yet somehow unified. The second theory moves into more complex territory. It proposes that this lineage could be a remnant of an ancient population that existed alongside early humans, a group that did not fully disappear but instead merged in very controlled ways. We already know that modern humans carry DNA from extinct relatives like Neanderthals and Denisovans. But this pattern doesn't quite match those known contributions. It is too consistent, too recent, and too structured. Which leads to the third theory. The one that researchers rarely say out loud, but quietly consider. That this lineage was not just preserved by cultural behavior or natural isolation, but by deliberate selection. That somewhere in the past, certain individuals were chosen, guided, or even managed in a way that ensured their genetic line would continue, largely unchanged. It's a difficult idea to accept. Because it implies a level of control over human reproduction that feels almost impossible for ancient societies. And yet, the evidence continues to point in that direction. The breakthrough came when a large-scale genomic study compared thousands of individuals across multiple continents. Using advanced sequencing techniques, scientists were able to isolate the specific segments of DNA that define this hidden lineage. What they found changed everything. These segments were not randomly distributed. They appeared in patterns that suggested inheritance through very specific lines, often skipping generations, reappearing in ways that did not follow simple genetic rules. It was as if the lineage had a mechanism for persistence, something that allowed it to remain intact even when diluted by surrounding populations. But the real twist came when researchers examined how these genetic segments behaved at a molecular level. They found that certain genes within this lineage showed signs of reduced recombination. In simple terms, they were less likely to be reshuffled during reproduction. This is extremely unusual. Because recombination is a fundamental part of how genetic diversity works. Without it, DNA remains more stable, more predictable, more preserved. This suggests that the lineage was not just culturally protected. It may have been biologically resistant to change. And that changes the entire narrative. Because now we are no longer looking at a passive survival of a bloodline. We are looking at something that actively maintains itself. Something that, by its very nature, resists disappearance. Imagine carrying a piece of history inside your body that refuses to fade. Imagine being part of a lineage that has quietly moved through centuries, untouched by the chaos of migration, war, and cultural transformation. It sounds almost impossible. But the data suggests it may be real. I try to understand what that would feel like. To know that your ancestry is not just a story, but a pattern, a structure that has been maintained with precision over time. It changes how you see identity. It changes how you see history. Because suddenly, history is not just what is written in books. It is what is written in your cells. And that brings us to the deeper question. Why does this matter? It matters because it challenges one of our most basic assumptions about humanity, that we are all the result of constant mixing, constant change, constant blending. But what if that is not the whole story? What if alongside the chaos of human history, there has always been a quiet order, a hidden structure, guiding certain lineages forward? Not controlling everything. Not shaping every outcome. But preserving something specific. Something intentional. We may never know exactly who or what started this process. We may never find a single moment in history where this decision was made. But the evidence suggests that it happened. And that it is still happening. Right now, there are people walking through the world carrying this lineage, completely unaware of what it represents. They live ordinary lives. They follow ordinary paths. But inside them is a genetic echo of something far older, far more deliberate than we ever imagined. And the most unsettling part is not that this lineage exists. It's that we are only just beginning to see it. But what if discovering this hidden lineage was only the beginning? Because when researchers continued their analysis, something even more difficult to explain started to appear. The pattern wasn't fading over time the way isolated genetic traits usually do. Instead, in certain cases, it was becoming clearer. In newer generations, the same preserved segments of DNA were showing up with stronger continuity, almost as if they were resisting dilution. This goes against one of the most basic expectations in genetics, where traits typically become more mixed and less defined over generations. Here, the opposite seemed to be happening. And that forced scientists to ask a far more unsettling question: what if this lineage is not just surviving, but actively maintaining itself? As studies expanded, a few researchers began to notice that these genetic markers were not only consistent, but also responsive. Environmental factors, which normally influence gene expression in predictable ways, seem to interact differently with this lineage. Certain genes appeared to activate under specific conditions, almost like a dormant system responding to triggers. This idea is still highly debated, but if true, it suggests something far more complex than simple inheritance. It suggests adaptability built into preservation. And that blurs the line between passive evolution and something that feels designed. At the same time, historical patterns began to align in unexpected ways. In multiple regions, individuals carrying these markers could be traced back to families that held unusual positions in society. Not always powerful, not always visible, but often placed in roles that allowed continuity. Record keepers, travelers, intermediaries between cultures. It's subtle, but consistent enough to raise questions. Were these just coincidences shaped by history? Or did these positions help ensure that the lineage could move, survive, and remain hidden across generations? What makes this even more complex is that no single theory fully explains all of these layers. The idea of closed communities preserving their genetics explains part of it, but not the global spread. Ancient ancestry explains the origin, but not the stability. And the possibility of deliberate selection explains the precision, but not the mechanism. Each answer opens another gap. Each explanation solves one piece, but creates another mystery. And then comes the possibility that changes everything. Some scientists now suggest that what we are seeing may not be a static bloodline at all. It could be a dynamic system, one that adjusts, persists, and reappears in ways we don't yet fully understand. If that's true, then this isn't just a story about the past. It's a process that may still be unfolding right now, quietly shaping individuals, families, and perhaps even the direction of human evolution itself. Imagine realizing that history is not just something behind us, but something still moving through us. That inside ordinary lives, there could be fragments of an ancient continuity, carrying forward without recognition. It changes how we think about identity. It changes how we think about time. Because suddenly, the boundary between past and future becomes less clear. And that brings us to the question we can no longer ignore. If this lineage is still active, still present, still preserving itself, what is it becoming? If you found this story thought-provoking, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the answers we're searching for are already written inside us.